Hello and welcome everyone to today's panel discussion on Asian and Asian American realities, racism, hate, resilience, and solidarity. This panel is the first of a three-part series exploring the lived realities of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. I am the Reverend Laura Mariko Heifetz, Assistant Dean of Admissions, Vocation, and Stewardship at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I use pronouns she, her, and hers. I am biracial Asian American of Japanese and white Jewish descent. We will be joined in this panel by the Reverend Gail Song Bantum of Quest Church, Dr. Paul C.H. Lim of Vanderbilt Divinity School and Vanderbilt University, the Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah of North Park University, and the Reverend Dr. Emilie M. Townes, Dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School. Before we begin, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the sponsors of this event, the co-curricular programs of Vanderbilt Divinity School, the Cal Turner Program in Moral Leadership, the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality, the Kelly Miller Smith Institute on Black Church Studies, the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, the Religion in the Arts and Contemporary Culture Program, and the Wenlin Cook Program in Religion and Justice. For our panel today, we will share in conversation. Each of the panelists will share briefly in response to a question from me. The remaining time will be conversation between the panelists and with those of you who are joining us today. For those of you joining live by YouTube, please feel free to use the comment function to the right of your screen to share reactions or ask questions of the panelists. My colleague, Sophia Agtarap, who is the Director of Communications and responsible for the aesthetic of our event today, will be the chat moderator on YouTube Live as well as Facebook and keep track of your questions. We encourage thoughtful and respectful dialogue and acknowledge that any conversation about white supremacy and violence is a sensitive subject. We also acknowledge that this is neither the first nor the last conversation we must have as people located on Indigenous land, and so we would like to do a land acknowledgement as we begin. The Office of Admissions, Vocation, and Stewardship joins the Vanderbilt student government in collectively acknowledging that Vanderbilt University occupies the ancestral hunting and traditional lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Today, these people have nation boundaries in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Mississippi, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced removal of Southern tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the Treaty of Hopewell. We recognize and support the Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those forcibly removed from their homelands. We also recognize the resistance, strength, and pride of other people of color whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled on this land without benefit or due compensation. We come alongside you as accomplices in the fight for equity. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this special event. We are in an era of coming to a better social understanding of the ways in which minoritized communities face hatred and violence, and the movements against this violence are finding traction in society at large. Whether it is missing and murdered Indigenous women, Black Lives Matter, or anti-Asian hate, we are faced with a truth that some of us have always known. This country is violent towards bodies it considers the other, whether or not it is acknowledged in the media or in our own communities. Asians and Asian Americans have faced violence based on race, gender, and religion or perceived religion, with South Asians experiencing rising rates of violence in and around the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001, and East Asians experiencing a sharp rise in verbal and physical assaults accompanied by racist rhetoric since the arrival of COVID-19 pandemic and the former president's virulently racist rhetoric. The shootings in and around Atlanta in March made it clear that the former president's reign of power is no longer a requisite ingredient for ongoing acts of hatred. In fact, what has been unleashed is part of something much older and deeper, rendering Asians and Asian Americans by turns invisible and hypervisible. Today, we will have some conversation based on the Christian context, acknowledging that so much of what is experienced in the United States is very much shaped by Christian theologies and Christian practices. And so I would like to invite in the Reverend Gail Song Bantum to join me in this conversation. And thank you so much for being here. Just invite you to share with us.
Reverend Laura, thank you so much for the invitation. Before I introduce myself, I am thrilled, I'm honored to be in the company of all of our panelists today. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Dean Emilie Townes, for inviting me to this space with Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I am a fan of every person on here, getting to meet people for the first time, like Dr. Lim. So just wanted to acknowledge that it is an absolute joy and a privilege to be in this space with you all. I am Reverend Gail Song Bantum. I am serving as the lead pastor of a church here in Seattle, in the heart of Seattle, Washington, called Quest Church. It is a diverse, multiracial, multicultural church. And I guess what I can bring to this conversation, in addition to my second generation Korean American female body, is the work of what it looks like to be a pastor, to be a leader for a particular community that holds many questions and tensions in the midst of our diversity. And in that space, we're constantly navigating within our community the tensions of race and racial violence, particularly over the past several years. I've been in this role for 2 years, but been an executive pastor at the same community for many years, over a decade. And I can say with certainty that there's almost never a week that goes by now in this particular moment where we're not asking ourselves, what do we pray? What do we preach? And what do we do? What do we call our community into in this moment, week after week, in the midst of intensified and visible acts of racial violence? Because it actually impacts the lives of our diverse people and our community. While it's happening seemingly out there in our country and around the world, it's also happening in the lives of my particular community and within the city of Seattle. And so because we're a multi-community, we try to hold many spaces of tension, and we try to be okay with that, right? So in the midst of increased anti-Asian violence and rhetoric, we also aren't afraid to talk about and name our proximity to whiteness historically. In the midst of dealing with realities of anti-Blackness and police brutality, we don't hold back when we're talking about patriarchy in the midst of particular communities as well. In the midst of us fighting for LGBTQ community to belong and be fully empowered within our community, we also aren't afraid to talk about toxic masculinity. Nobody's comfortable in our community because nobody's arrived. And we try to live into our namesake of being on a quest, right? Constantly looking for spaces of life and liberation. And oftentimes, somebody once said to me that any good thing, any worthwhile thing ought to cost us something. And so the life of our community, as I'm seeing it unfold in real time, is a costly life. It's a costly endeavor. And when Jesus says, drop your net and follow me, look to the margin, look to the people, touch the people that nobody else wants to touch, speak to the people that nobody else wants to speak to, bring in, invite the people that are seemingly far off and allow them to be near. That ought to cost us something. And this community called Quest that I have the privilege of leading actually mirrors my own life. So there's a deep resonance for me as its lead pastor. It's not just a job or a role for me. There's a deep resonance and a kind of extension, really, of my story and my life. As a second generation Korean American woman, I don't necessarily even hold my body in ways that are expected of me, even within my own community, right? I'm very outspoken. I'm demonstrative. I've always been like this, and it probably stems from having a mother who was very certain of her call in life, a mother who was an immigrant, but was also called to be a pastor in a very patriarchal culture and church context and tradition. But I had a mother who fought her way to being a pastor, to living into her call. And unfortunately, losing her too soon when I was younger, that was wrought with questions of identity for me in the midst of not feeling like I belonged anywhere, really, in my white school, my predominantly white schools, within the immigrant Korean community, the church that my parents were a part of. And then also just feeling my difference even within the context of my own people. And so it wasn't too long after that where I found myself really immersed and welcomed and embraced into the Black community and to a Black church particularly, and found my embrace, found my belonging amidst people who were seemingly different than me. And shortly after, marrying a Black man, for whom I lost relationship with my father, my own blood, and costly, 20 plus years. Costly because I believed that Black lives mattered and this Black life mattered. So with this kind of story and identity that I hold in my body, it allows me to invite a larger community like Quest into similar spaces of in-betweenness, of not belonging, of advocating, of living a life that's costly, where we withhold nothing for the sake of life and liberation for all, a life of solidarity in not just your words or on social media, but with your body. It's a story and identity that invites people into joining with others, and especially with a people and community that's seemingly not our own. And so what a gift, but also what a challenge. It's the beauty and the burden of leadership. It's a beauty and burden of being a second generation immigrant. It's the beauty and burden of being a leader of a multi-context. And it's also the beauty and burden of having lived a life that has cost me something. And so there's no going back at this point. And so I'm grateful to be able to share a bit of my story and a bit of my journey. And I look forward to what unfolds, not only within the life of our particular community at Quest, but the ways that they will then bear witness to a life-giving, liberating kingdom of God that we fight for on the daily. Thank you for that, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite in the Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah to speak.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for
Your
this
audio
wonderful
is
opportunity.
your audio is not
weak. How's that? Better? Man, we just tested this like 3 seconds ago too. Let's try this again. Can you hear me? I got this fancy microphone and everything.
It's very staticky.
Very staticky. All right. I'm going to switch to, sadly, the standard microphone for my computer if it's a
If you could unmute yourself.
Better? Can you hear me better? Okay, not sure where the static was coming from. My apologies. Thank you, Vanderbilt. Dear friends, it's always good to be in the company of friends, and this conversation is occurring in that context of company of friends and colleagues. So I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about lament as the appropriate response to what is happening in the world around us, and then give some of the background of why lament is an essential and appropriate response. I wrote a book a few years ago on the Book of Lamentations, and the reason for that book was to engage a lost spiritual discipline, a lost spiritual practice, which is the practice of lament. And it was notable that the American church in particular was very deficient in the practice of lament. I define lament very simply. It is the appropriate liturgical, spiritual, ecclesial response to the reality of suffering, pain, and crisis in the world. I want to focus on that second part, because without knowing the reality of suffering, pain, and crisis, you don't have the appropriate response. So a lot of what's happening now around issues on race and violence, particularly in the AAPI community, we need a snapshot of reality. We need a snapshot of what is happening and how we got here. And the way I would explain our current dilemma of engaging race from the Asian American perspective and in the area of Asian American people is that we have failed to acknowledge how much of white supremacy has fundamentally shaped the perspective and perception of Asian Americans. So I'll start with a parallel example. And this is the reality that the gaze of the white male, the privileged gaze of the white male, gives the other person that is being viewed by the white male a category that the rest of society fits into. So what the white male sees in the black male, for example, is the way the rest of society sees the black male. And when the white male gazes upon the black male and sees the black male as a pet or a threat, the black male is the pet that makes us laugh, or those black comedians that make us laugh, the black hip hop artists that make us dance, and the black athlete that makes us stand up and cheer for our nation and for our team. That's the pet identification of the black male. And then the other side of that is the threat identification. And we're clearly seeing that now in the trial of Derek Chauvin. The characterization of George Floyd as the threat, as if George Floyd were on trial. Or you see this in the way we think about the unidentified black male as a threat to our community. The black male who has committed all these crimes and has this very wide range of description. The unidentified black male who is between 15 and 45 years old, who weighs anywhere from 150 to 300 pounds, who's anywhere from 5'8" to 6'8" tall. So the gaze of the white male in viewing the black male kind of forces these categorizations, which our society adapts. And that's interesting because that's been part of the dilemma with the Asian community. We have accepted the gaze of the white male as normative for how we as Asian community might be viewing the black male. Now, it's interesting because the parallel exists within the gaze of the white male on the Asian American as well. So when the white male views the Asian American, it's also a pet threat matrix. The Asian Americans are the pet when we serve the function of the model minority. We are trotted out in moments where, why can't the other ethnic groups act like the model minority? Why can't you pull yourselves up by your bootstraps like the Asians seem to have done? Now, we know that there's actually the third M, which is the model minority mythology. So this is a myth, but it is a myth that perpetuates this idea of the Asian American as society's pet. Be like these Asians, these well-behaved Asians. They don't do the things that other groups do, or they, again, have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. The other side of that, of course, is the Asian American as the threat, the yellow peril. And we've seen in U.S. history the attempt to mitigate that threat, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, U.S. citizens who have Japanese descent. And more recently, of course, the idea of creating this threat matrix for Asian Americans through the pandemic. Maybe another example would be, of course, Vincent Chin. During the time that Asian Americans, or particularly Japanese Americans, were viewed as an economic threat. And here's a Chinese American who was beaten up by former auto workers because that Chinese American represented the Japanese threat against the auto industry. So that pet threat matrix does not only apply to African Americans, it also applies to the Asian American context. There's another level of this that Bell Hooks talks about with the way women are perceived. So what is the gaze of the white male on black women, and what is the gaze of the white male on Asian women? Bell Hooks talks about the black women are viewed by the white male gaze as the mammy and the Jezebel, either the hypersexualized person, the Jezebel, or the servant who kind of takes care of you, the mammy. And we actually saw this in the very recent conversation around the Atlanta shootings, where we saw the victims kind of portrayed in this light. And what we saw was the empathy and the sympathy that went towards the shooter, saying, oh, the person has a sex addiction and poor guy, he had a bad day. And his gaze was determinative of the victims. And so when this shooter was seen as someone who was had a bad day, who was a sex addict, then the victims, by the gaze of the white male, was identified as sex workers. Now, never mind that, the 4 Korean women in particular who were killed were 73, 69, 63, 50 some years old. It was automatically assumed, oh, Asians who work at a spa, Asian women, they must be sex workers. So again, it's the determination of whose privileged perspective gets to determine what that person's identity is. And we saw that very clearly again in the Atlanta shootings, where Asian women were first sexual objects. They must work at these sexual massage parlors. There's no indication of that. Spa in Korean culture is very different than spa in other cultures. Spa for us is, if you ever see the Conan O'Brien, Steve Yoon YouTube clip, that's a spa for us. You go there, old people go there to work on their, sore muscles and bones, but then it became kind of this hypersexualized imagery. Or these older Korean women were servants. They were invisible. They were the ones that pick up the towels. They were the ones that sweep the floors. So again, it goes to the mammy Jezebel ideal, but now translated over into the Asian American identity. What I'm pointing to is that the deeper underlying problem is not just the shooting. Of course, that's a problem, and that was a explicit expression of a hate crime, as well as the 4,000 hate crimes and assaults on Asian Americans over the last year, as documented by Stop AAPI Hate. But how all of that is playing into the dominant culture, white supremacist gaze, and how our identity is not based upon how God views us or how we view ourselves, but our identity is shaped to our detriment and to our harm by the dominant gaze of white culture and society. In another dysfunctional way, we saw this with kind of Christian publishing, where Christian publishers put out curriculum like Rickshaw Rally, where it exoticized Asian Americans or Japanese Americans. The skit guys a few years ago had a skit where they, made fun of Chinese takeout food. There was a curriculum on leadership called Deadly Viper, where they actually had images of like teenage Asian girls with kind of sexualized clothing, bare midriff. And the whole idea was that these are the vipers that are out to kill you. These are the threats, the sexualized threat against your, strong white male leadership. So these narratives are out there and they continue to perpetuate. And the response then is the repentance, confession, and lament, recognizing how deep these negative stereotypes and images and imaginations have become a part of our American Christian perspective. I'll just close by saying that I found it interesting that after the Atlanta shootings, the first group of people that really got what was going on for the Asian community, and just on a personal note, reached out to me with notes and phone calls and just like expressions of concern. The first line of defense that I experienced, people that told me we're with you, we're on your side, were Black and brown women. They were the ones that were the first folks to email me, call me. My dear friend and Vanderbilt professor, Phyllis Shepard. I'm going to just kind of call her out as in a good way to say she was one of the first people to email me and say, how are you doing? Are you okay? And I that really moved me because she got it. She understood it. An older Latino woman who I've been doing mentoring with, she emailed me right away and said, I put a coupon in DoorDash for you to make sure that you're eating okay. An African-American woman in my neighborhood made food and delivered it and said, I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted this to be an expression of love and concern. And that's where that empathy, that mutual lament really emerged from that common narrative. And I think this is where the space of that mutuality, that concern for the other, that could be a place of healing and unity because it's a common lament that we enter into. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next, I will invite Dr. Paul C.H. Lim.
Thank you so much. First of all, I think it's a great delight that we get to have this event, which I think is the first time in Vanderbilt University's timeline, talking about Asian and Asian American lives, talking about the issues that concern us and the better hope for all of us, not just for Asians and Asian American AAPI folks. I'd like to start with this quote from someone that most of us do not know anything about. I certainly didn't know until very, very recently. His name is Lawson Funao Inada. He was one of the persons who was incarcerated during the World War II. He was a full-on American citizen of Japanese descent. He wrote these words: "Only what we could carry was the rule to bring to the internment camps. So we carried strength, dignity, and soul." This is the book that I have in mind, and this is a book called Un-American: The Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II. Images by, among others, Ansel Adams and government photographers. I would like to begin also with a reading from the last book in the Christian scriptures, Revelation chapter 21, because it sets for us a kind of dialectic or tensional reality that we experience. Many in the Christian community, but all of us human beings recognize the world is not the way it's supposed to be. It is in a sort of a trajectory of bettering itself. Sometimes you don't know whether that is always the case. This is what it says: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling is now among God's people, and God will dwell with them. They will be the people of God, and God themselves will be with them and be their God. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.' The one who was seated on the throne said, 'I am making everything new.' Then God said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" So these promises of the end times, eschatological promise of the end is yet to come. We still have a lot of tears that are being shed. There are so many more death and mourning and crying and pain. But according to the Reformed tradition that I'm part of, it is more than just not yet. There are elements of already that propels me and all of us, I hope, to activism, calling out injustice, and wiping away tears from people right here and right now, because there are deaths and there are mourning and crying and pain. So I am of Korean descent. I came to America as I was finishing up middle school from South Korea. And ever since that day in December 1982, I have become daily aware of my racial and cultural otherness. And so that is, and especially in light of what's been going on in the last year, as I've had more opportunities to talk about my own story, most people are quite surprised to hear something like that. And it reflects and reveals more than anything else the kind of deeply ingrained sense of model minority for someone who looks like me. But I want to offer in our brief time together a bit of a long duration of historical perspective on how dominant cultures have seen the racial and religious others. So as Soong-Chan has mentioned, this phrase "yellow peril," that is a very important kind of a phrase to think about. It has more than just an American pedigree of the 19th century. It has sort of a European genealogy, much longer. So Kaiser Wilhelm II urged his fellow European empires around the turn of the 20th century to conquer and hopefully colonize China with this rhetoric around the beginning of the 20th century. Whether it was the Mongol invasion of Europe between 1236 and 1290, or even the Ottoman invasion of Europe in the 16th century, all the way to the 18th century, whenever Europe was invaded by external forces, it seems the trajectory of propaganda was always racialized and religiously hyped up. Geraldine Heng, a professor at UT Austin, her award-winning book called The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, a very, very important book for a lot of people doing this kind of scholarship today, makes a trenchant critique of those who would locate the beginning of race consciousness for the purpose of discrimination and destruction, conquer and colonizing, much earlier to the medieval context rather than the 17th or 18th or even the 19th century. So it seems that we have a long duration of racial prejudice and power plays that were weaponized against minority groups along color and religious lines. Then the prominent strategy of minoritized groups have either been acquiescence, adaptation, assimilation, or antagonism, or assault. So, for example, I did my graduate studies in England, and I would often encounter my friends who would kind of live into this reality or propaganda, be more English than the native English are. Such were the self-imposed pressure placed upon the African and Caribbean Black Brits. Now just come over the Atlantic, then you have so many Asian Americans, be they of Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, South Asian, or of Korean backgrounds. The majority adopted a sort of a live, pragmatic approach of give us land to open up our businesses, restaurants, we'll do our best that our children have better luck tomorrow than we do. Then the children are often told to work hard, keep your head down, because America will give us what you want and what it promises. Middle-class lifestyle, be doctors, lawyers, engineers, because with those skill sets, white people cannot take away your own sense of asset and ambitions and aspirations. For over a century of self-imposed inculcation of Americanizing strategy has in some ways backfired on the Asian American communities. We already talked about Yellow Peril, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, China's massacre of Los Angeles in 1871, policies against interracial marriages. And one of the things that we need to actually come out and talk about is the pitting brown and black bodies against the yellow bodies has been the strategy of white normalcy or white supremacy. So as I talk to some of my friends who are mostly kind of centrist politically and religiously, they kind of balk at the idea of white supremacy. They would say, well, I'm not a white supremacist. I understand it and I get it. But then I kind of have come up with I don't think I'm the first one to use it, but white normalcy. What is normal? Because in our cultural context in North America, what has been deemed as normal has been white, as Soong-Chan made it very clear, and also for Gail's kind of powerful testimony about her loss. And for her father, too, I think there's both a deeply ingrained racial prejudice as well as something that he's also kind of embraced as part of this new American phenomenon. So whether intentional or incidental, and I am now convinced that it was top-down intentional and grassroots more a combination of incidentality and intentionality. Many racialized communities fell right into the trap of be divided and be conquered. That is the beginning of oppression Olympics of these United States of America. So I want to share some concrete proposals here, if I may be so bold to share some of these things, because as a historian, I'm not supposed to have any kind of prescriptives, but as someone of faith commitments and convictions, and also as somebody who works as a scholar in residence at our local church, I'd like to share these proposals. Number one, we stand together. Be an ally yourself and ask your friends to become allies. So ever since these, Kung flu or China virus, people have begun to notice that there is an uptick of attack on Asian and Asian American bodies. And when I share these things, my friends are often surprised, like, "Oh, I didn't realize that was going on." And so I think, and it's many of my friends are kind of living into their mostly white realities, and some other colored as well, but mostly white friends. They tend to kind of assume their life is status quo. But until they're actually provoked to think about life outside their immediate bubble, and all of us have been living in bubbles. I've been living in this bubble, as you can see in the background of my office right here. And so I think it is these things that that we need to kind of ask our friends to become allies and begin to see things from other people's perspectives, from the racialized bodies that are often been weaponized, as well as different religions as well. I was talking to my sister, a community leader as a physician and someone who loves all people 24/7, 100%. Yes, she said that she lives out in the Seattle area. She did a lot of repenting after the death of George Floyd, that she was finally awakened. And then she said the shooting of Atlanta really kind of woke her up to see the kind of need for solidarity and allyship that is really lacking. Monday this week, there was a key event held earlier and at the Apostolic Faith Church of Chicago called Black and Asian Christians United Against Racism, attended by Reverend Otis Moss III, Reverend Charlie Dates, Reverend Ray Chang, the one who organized this event, and our own Dr. Soong-Chan Rah was here with us on this panel, and Reverend Waltrina Middleton and others talked about a lot of issues that were often deemed to be too controversial to talk about. For a Filipino pastor, it was COVID-1521 in the same way that for Reverend Moss, it is COVID-1619, the year of the arrival in Virginia of the first settlement of enslaved Africans. 1521 is a year of Spanish conquest and colonization of the Philippines. Ray Chang was prophetic when he called out this type of anti-Blackness that exists in the Asian American community, which was further fueled by white supremacist logic that has been internalized by our communities, he said. And so Chang called for a series of in-house conversations among Asian Americans, those of you who are watching, perhaps in order not to perpetuate the harms of a racialized framework created and curated by white supremacy, often done so in the name of God. So be an ally. Ask your friends to become an ally, right? Like I said, many of my friends have been rather surprised to hear that, and many are becoming more aware of it. And I become increasingly tired of the myth of model minority. Silence from the top can be deafening too. I mean, I personally am so glad that my dear dean, Emilie Townes, has been at the forefront of speaking out and calling out against these injustices wherever they are found. Where there is one injustice against one is injustice against all. Number two is learn more about the stories of struggle and resilience. More writers and storytellers are needed from the Asian diaspora communities. And I think one book that I've actually enjoyed reading a lot is Gordon Chang's book called Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic story of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. We hear about it. Gordon Chang is the Olive Palmer Professor in the Humanities and Professor of History at Stanford University. And I'm so glad that there are people like Professor Chang at Stanford who's actually calling into our own consciousness of the multiple and variegated contributions that all peoples have made, certainly including peoples of color. And so we need to ask, are resources available in our neighborhoods, in our community libraries, or in our schools, community colleges, high schools, or universities around? Number three is collateral damage is a real thing. Speak truth to power. So I think one of the things that we have become much more aware of is the global connectivity, that what happens in one part of the world does impact us in a very ferocious and direct manner. And this COVID-19 is one such example, right? So I was talking to an elected official recently about the danger words we use and the rhetoric we employ to talk about the racial other. When one talks about what's going on in China as its treatment, the government's treatment of the Uyghur minority, which are double minorities, both ethnic and religious minorities, are Muslims. And what they're doing against the people of Uyghur background is absolutely reprehensible. But what I was sharing with this elected official was that, look, there's also something called unintended consequences or collateral damage, which is really real. Because what has happened as a result is that because people who don't see Vincent Chin as non-Japanese or Paul Lim as non-Chinese, to the white normalcy, white supremacist logic person, I look just like a Chinese person, and they don't need to ask it. And there will be taunting, and perhaps even worse yet, as we see happen, would be severe bodily damage and incurable emotional scars, and also even death. So put pressure on elected officials. Talk to your CEOs and presidents, and wherever you may be. Don't be just a nice person. I may say God's got your back. Number 4, hatred will always lose. Love wins always. Recently, I was teaching on Simon Wiesenthal's Sunflower, on the possibilities and limits of forgiveness. And it's a very, very powerful book. It is about the asking of this SS officer in his deathbed confession and asking a Jewish concentration camper for forgiveness. That was Simon Wiesenthal. Doesn't give it to him. And for the rest of his life, he writes this book and has lots of conversations, hundreds, if not thousands of conversations about that. And I think what Wiesenthal has said toward the end of his life is something like this, that has been also said by people like Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi, and certainly Jesus himself. Hatred will always lose in the end. Love will always win. So Dalai Lama, coming from a different perspective, says something very, very similar. So Dalai Lama was one of the panelists who was asked to talk about this. The Sunflower, the second part is the symposium. And this is what he said. Here, I would like to relate a very interesting incident. A few years ago, a Tibetan monk who had served about 18 years in a Chinese prison in Tibet came to see me after his escape to India. I knew him from my days in Tibet and remember last seeing him in 1959. During the course of that meeting, I had asked him what he felt was the biggest threat or danger while he was incarcerated. I was amazed by his answer. It was extraordinary and inspiring. I was expecting him to say something else. Instead, he said that what he most feared was losing his compassion for the Chinese. So I think it is important to kind of think about the pathway laid out by people like this Tibetan monk or Jesus of Nazareth, talking about how love will always, in the end, win. So I think, the second question that Dean Heifetz raised was, what do we do in theological education? So I am in theological education. I would say this, on teaching of the history of Christianity, especially American religious history, it has been predominantly taught as white Protestant history at a place like Vanderbilt Divinity School. And I just need to call it out as such. Catholics were often out until recently. African American Christianities had been left out until recently. Asian American Christian history was left out and is still left out. So we need to encourage and call our people who teach in theological education to see the truly global realities that are right here in America. As my good friend and a colleague here at Vanderbilt, Professor Ben Tran, says so well, learning about Asian American history is learning about American history and learning about global history therein. So I do think that, as I come to a close, and I'd love to invite for the conversation after our dean speaks, about these realities that we're both in terms of lived reality as well as the theoretical historiographical level. We're all living as global communities of people who are looking for better tomorrow, fighting for justice, hoping for love, and seeking faith. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite Dean Townes in. You're muted.
All right, how's that?
Great.
Thank you. This has been also an education for me, and it won't be surprising for most of you, I hope, who know anything about me, is that I've been listening as carefully as I can and scribbling notes to myself of things to follow up on, to think through more clearly or completely. And I want to thank the panelists for being generous enough to share different slices of what you're going through, and what that means for the communities you serve. And I want to start with that because I want to underscore the ways in which we tend to make communities monoliths rather than to see the great diversity that's in any community, even when the community is white. We tend to lump ourselves in groups, and then we pretend to know something about the group we know nothing about. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the ways in which we tend to live our lives in a world of stereotypes. And one of the challenges that I'm hearing very clearly today and in other spaces is we need to recognize that and undo it as quickly as possible. Too many of us are seen as the models for something. And usually that model has little to do with the diversity or the realities of how people are living their lives and what that means and the histories they come from and the peoples they come in contact with and the theologies they spin out and the ways that we just simply try to sit in the world and be, if we're allowed to simply sit in the world and be. And too often we have to justify our existence in various spaces. Now, I think some of that has to do with the question we must all ask. Are we willing to educate ourselves? Are we willing to admit our ignorance and our great ability to stereotype, to cover over the fact that we don't know really what the differences between the various Asian groups sitting right here in the United States? Now, I've been a Southerner all my life. Even when I was living up South and out South, I was still a Southerner. And it wasn't until a few weeks ago when Sophia Agtarak just very matter-of-factly said, well, you know, there's a huge Asian community in the South. And she began to tell me about the community, gave me some resources. And frankly, I was sitting there stunned that I had no idea that this was true. And that said to me, if I am someone who says that she wants to be aware of what's going on, not only among Black folk, but other folk, to not know this, and it's not like a little teeny weeny community either, to not know this, how difficult a task we have before us, and how necessary the task is that we take it on. We take it on not only so that we don't do stupid and sometimes violent and deadly things to folks we don't know or we objectify, but that we ourselves are killing ourselves with our lack of knowledge. Not just one person dies, a community dies when we don't recognize the great diversities within our midst and respect them, value them, understand that like any other set of folk in the world, there are going to be some really bright folks and some pretty dim folks within that community, but don't use a stereotype to label any group. So as I was looking at the various reports that came out of Atlanta over these last several days, one of the things that struck me so profoundly is the inability of the media to look at the complexity of people's lives. The assumption that the workers in the spa had to be sex workers. Not sure where that comes from. Well, I am sure where it comes from. Let me not be naive. But why? Reporters are supposed to seek the truth, not perpetuate stereotypes. why would we assume this? Well, we have very little knowledge of what spa means in some Asian cultures. And I find it really problematic that we shrink a group of women down to sex workers without asking, how do we know this? Where does it come from us that we assume that this is right? And this is the only way we can categorize these women. And I heard a powerful sermon in chapel just yesterday that suggested we have so criminalized our bodies that a natural wish to experience sex and sexuality and our own bodiness is seen as demonic and something to be rooted out. And the only way this young man decided to root it out was to kill some people that had nothing to do with the fact that he liked his own body and somebody else's too. Now, that was an edgy sermon, and I don't want to go too far into it because it's stepping on the edge of stepping off a fairly large argument. But what I'm trying to point out is the fact that we simply don't know each other. As much as we try to know each other, we don't know each other, and what we don't know, we often can't respect and don't respect. So as I'm thinking about what I've learned today, and what I will continue to try to learn, is how do I, as a dean, Black woman, pretty obvious, lesbian, most know, leading a school that's predominantly white, liberal to progressive, but we've got a lot of theological diversity. How do we, as a school, start to open our own eyes to the diversity in our midst, on our faculty, in our student body? The fact that we have a great diversity of theological positions. We have a growing number of diverse racial, ethnic groups, nationalities. And we can't use the, oh, we're a liberal as a cover to be able to deal with that, because dealing with it takes work. And so I want to end with a sort of confession of sorts, saying, I need to watch myself as much as I, as an ethicist, love to watch others and talk about them. Usually talk about them badly most times. But I can never be so comfortable anymore that I don't look in the mirror and ask myself, where am I in the tragedies that have stepped off in this country? And how have I contributed? And how have we as a school of divinity also not been there to answer the bell? Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have lots of great questions, and we may not have time. We will not have time to get to all of them, but I think what we'll do is we'll try to turn some of these into blog posts or social media posts from our guests today. But I do want to bring this one question in from Beth, because I think that everyone here could definitely contribute to it. Why don't we as Christian folks talk more about the role of white supremacy or white normalcy birthing white supremacy or white normalcy? If we don't dismantle both, are we missing the root for the branch? So wondering who would like to kick that off.
As a historian in the group, I'd like to take a first stab and turn it over to ethicists and preachers. And so this has been something that has been on my mind a lot, since my area of specialization was and is early modern England. There was a preacher in London in the 1560s named Gerald Aylmer, Aylmer, who proudly proclaimed from his pulpit that God is English. Now, you hear that? God is English. That means it was uttered in the context of the Elizabethan kind of a clash between the Protestant England and Catholic Spain. And this is something that I would regard as a sort of the birth pain of Protestant England that basically began to kind of propel really powerfully the idea of religious nationalism. God is English means God is not Spanish, God is not Algerian, God is not Chinese, God is certainly not Indian. Therefore, it really consolidated and congealed the sense that God's role is to favor one nation over everybody else. And you basically have that group a few decades later coming over to these shores of the United States of America. And what you have is a perfect trifecta, a confluence of religious nationalisms when faced with people who don't look like you and worship different deities. Then your job is simply to, in the name of God, move them outward, move them further out, take away their lands, take away their dignities, take away their identities. And that's what we have going on. I do think that, for me, especially as somebody, as Dean Emilie mentioned, yes, I am one of those persons who, falls into sort of a non-majority theological perspective as sort of an evangelical Christian with lots of questions about what that word means. But I simply take that to mean as evangelium, as the good news of Jesus Christ, the Jewish carpenter who became a charismatic leader, who was ultimately crucified by the Roman authorities. But I do think that one of the things that the white normalcy and white supremacy at birth here in America, but much more before that, was the idea of religious supremacy and ethnic supremacy and national identity merging together is in that sort of a murky trifecta that gave clear pathway for eradication of anything other than that. I'm a person of the 80s. I'll end with this. There was a band called Erasure, right? It's a synth pop band. And I think about the word erasure a lot in our context. We tend to either, because of our ignorance, as Emilie mentioned, about just not knowing anything about the other group, or intentionally erasing the memories of the other. And I do think that one of the dangers of white Christianity, to put it bluntly, or white conservative Christianity, is to really kind of talk about the supremacy of Christ in such a way that ends up erasing any other vestigial elements of others. And I think we have to actually come to a wake-up moment of recognizing that global Christianity, there are far more Christians who are not white, globally speaking. There are more black and brown and yellow bodies who call on the name of Jesus than white bodies. And I think it is high time for us to come to recognize it and walk in the pathway of humility and humble love of neighbor and the Savior.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to weigh in on this one? Sorry, Dean, you look like you were about to say something.
I think taking a peek at James Cone's work, it's pretty clear that there have been some Black theologians who have said, yes, white supremacy and white people are the problem. And it only makes it worse when they attach Christianity to it and make it holy. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there.
I'll throw an idea out there, and just as a conversation starter, something that my co-author Mark Charles and I were looking at is the power and impact of trauma in our conversations on race. Static?
Yep. Now mute.
Apologies for the technical problems. So my co-author Mark Charles and I was exploring this at a very preliminary level, and we're not counselors or therapists, so we don't have the expertise on this, but the idea of, and there's other works on this, the idea of trauma as it relates to race and racial conversations. My Grandmother's Hands, The Body Keeps Score, excellent works on this topic. But one of the questions I was asking is, we are pretty good at describing the trauma felt by people of color, women of color, people of color. Again, excellent works on this topic. Is there a chance that white people are also traumatized and are responding to white supremacy as those who are perpetrators of trauma, but also traumatized by white supremacy themselves? So the hyper-defensiveness is what a traumatized person would do, but they're not the victims of the trauma, they're the perpetrators of that trauma. So in the same way, like Han theology gives us language about understanding sin from those who commit the sin, but also in Han, those who are the victims of sin, could trauma also be understood as those who have experienced the pain of white supremacy, but also those who have benefited are also experiencing a form of trauma, obviously very different. But that's where some of that defensiveness comes in, the fragility comes in. That's a group of people that have been traumatized by this unreasonable standard of white supremacy that they can't live into, and so they are traumatized by it, but also wanting it, American greatness. White American exceptionalism. And so again, this is just kind of a beginnings of an idea. And I think those who are more equipped to it around the issue of trauma might be better equipped to handle this. But it's a question that I've been trying to ask. Are white people traumatized by white supremacy as well?
Thank you all. And Gail, just wondering if you wanted to weigh in at all?
Yeah, maybe I can just piggyback off of what Dr. Soong-Chan just mentioned. Let me keep mine to Quest specifically, my community. At Quest, white supremacy is always part of the conversation. But what makes that possible is the assumption, right, of our complexity and the ways power and society shape all of us. And I think sometimes this is what I meant earlier when it's the hesitance of people and their ability to hold tension. Because for the places that avoid these complexities and tensions, white supremacy finds an easy home, right? Because it provides easy answers and privileges, comfort and answers we are comfortable with. But both are necessarily the truth. So I think this notion of holding tension, holding complexity, helps us get to the root.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for these great questions. I am going to wrap us up, but we will be addressing these questions in other formats. So much gratitude for these panelists and for those of you who participated in the live event. We will be having 2 more sessions. They will be announced on our social media and on our homepage. At Vanderbilt Divinity, we believe knowledge must be applied. So the next event is a teach-in. And we believe our location in the Southeast is integral to the education of all VDS community members. So the 3rd event will be a film screening of a film about a California Chinese American family's discovery of their Mississippi roots and connections with the Black community from the 1900s. I would like to leave us with a quote from activist, prison camp survivor, and freedom fighter Yuri Kochiyama. Remember that consciousness is power. Consciousness is education and knowledge. Consciousness is becoming aware. It is the perfect vehicle for students. Consciousness raising is pertinent for power, and be sure that power will not be abusively used, but used for building trust and goodwill domestically and internationally. Tomorrow's world is yours to build. So you can follow us at divinity.vanderbilt.edu. And we hope to see you at some of our other events. Thank you again so much to these fantastic panelists. It was lovely to be in community with you for this conversation.